All right, everyone, buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into some seriously intriguing research today, something you definitely don't want to miss. We're talking about the possibility of, get this, DNA contamination in RNA vaccine vials. Yeah, you heard that right.
Definitely caught my attention too. It's got the science world talking, that's for sure.
For good reason.
Yeah.
John Campbell even did a deep dive on his YouTube channel covering Dr. David Speicher's findings. And what Dr. Speicher found is pretty unsettling. He took a look at 32 of these vials, and guess what? Every single one had DNA contamination.
That in itself is kind of a bombshell, but it's the type of DNA they found that's causing the real stir.
Right. It wasn't just any DNA either. They found traces of plasmid DNA.
From E. coli bacteria.
E. coli. Hold on a sec. E. coli as in the bacteria.
The very same. And it's a common player in vaccine production.
Okay, now I'm really curious. So we're talking about E. coli DNA in RNA vaccines. Why is this setting off alarm bells?
It all boils down to how these vaccines are made. They use E. coli to cultivate large amounts of viruses. Then they use those viruses to create the vaccines.
I'm following so far.
The problem is, even with all the fancy purification steps, sometimes tiny bits of DNA from those E. coli cells can stick around in the final product.
Okay, so let's say there's some leftover E. coli DNA. How on earth does that DNA actually get inside our cells? It's not like it just teleports into our DNA, right?
Not quite teleportation, but it is a fascinating process. It all comes down to those microscopic delivery systems, the lipid nanoparticles.
Yeah, those things that carry the RNA instructions for the spike protein.
Exactly. Well, here's the kicker. Those lipid nanoparticles. They could be picking up the contaminating DNA and carrying it along for the ride. And because these nanoparticles can travel throughout the body...
That means this DNA could end up in cells all over the place.
Precisely.
And that's where things start to get a little unnerving, right? Because once that DNA is inside a cell, what happens next? Does it just hang out there harmlessly? Or...
That's the million-dollar question. And it's the possibility of this DNA, this contaminating DNA, actually integrating itself into our own DNA that has some scientists concerned, tucked away right there inside our cell's nucleus.
I can see why that would be a concern. So let's unpack this whole DNA integration issue a bit further. Because if this DNA can actually become part of our genetic code, what does that mean for our health?
It really is the crux of the matter, isn't it? See, when you get this foreign DNA possibly embedding itself into our chromosomes, well, it could really mess with how our genes normally do their thing.
So it's like those genes are suddenly working with faulty blueprints.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. You know, think of it like inserting a typo into a sentence. It might seem small, but it can completely change the meaning, right?
Right. And I'm guessing those genetic typos, those are what could potentially lead to some serious health problems down the line. I mean, we're talking things like cancer, right?
That's the theoretical risk that has a lot of researchers on edge. What Dr. Speicher found that's particularly interesting, though, he found evidence of this contamination on chromosomes 9 and 12 specifically.
Chromosomes 9 and 12. Is there something about those particular chromosomes?
Well, it turns out chromosomes 9 and 12 are kind of important players. They contain genes that control things like cell growth and division.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. So if this contaminating DNA were to mess with those genes, it could theoretically throw a wrench in the whole system.
Exactly. It could make those cells go a little haywire, start growing out of control, and, well, that's a pretty direct path to potential cancer development.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely not something to take lightly. But this isn't just some abstract hypothetical worry, is it? Dr. Speicher is actually working on a test for long COVID. And that seems to tie directly into all of this, doesn't it?
You're right. His work goes way beyond just theory. He's laser focused on developing a test to detect something called abnormal spike protein production.
Abnormal spike protein production. Okay, so how does that relate to, long COVID?
Well, there's this theory gaining traction that this integrated DNA, the stuff we've been talking about, could actually be the culprit behind why some people keep producing spike proteins long after their initial vaccination.
So we could be talking about a link between this DNA contamination and those persistent long COVID symptoms. That's huge.
It is big, and it gets even more complex when we start talking about something called frame shifting.
Frame shifting. Honestly, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's a bit complicated, yeah, but stick with me. It's fascinating. Imagine our genetic code is like a language, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
And like any language, it's very precise. Every 3 letters, we call them codons, represent a specific amino acid.
Amino acids, those are the building blocks of proteins, right?
You got it. So those amino acids get strung together to make proteins, but here's the mind-blowing part. If you shift those letters even a little bit, if you disrupt that three-letter code, it can totally change which amino acids are produced.
And that changes the protein that's made.
Exactly. Now, apply that to what we're talking about. That means this DNA contamination could be interfering with how our bodies read the genetic code for the spike protein.
So like a miscommunication at the cellular level.
100%. And that miscommunication, that frame shifting, could be causing our cells to produce these abnormal spike proteins. Now, here's why that's potentially a big deal. Some scientists believe it's these abnormal spike proteins, not the normal ones, that might be setting off an inflammatory response in the body. And that inflammation, that could be a major contributor to those long COVID symptoms people are experiencing.
So we're talking about a domino effect. Contamination leading to frame shifting, leading to abnormal spike proteins, leading to inflammation, and ultimately leading to long COVID symptoms.
You've got it. It's a complex chain reaction, and we're only just beginning to understand the potential ramifications.
Wow. It really highlights how much we still don't know. Are there any other pieces to this puzzle we need to be aware of? This is where I gotta admit, it gets a little, I don't know, unsettling. Like we're looking at this puzzle, right, but we're missing some pieces.
And without those missing pieces, it's tough to fully grasp the potential risks, let alone figure out solutions.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, is there more to this story than we even realize? I mean, even Health Canada, they acknowledged that a DNA fragment in some vaccines could potentially cause cancer.
Right, and
But they downplayed it. They basically said, don't worry about it.
which is kind of hard to swallow when you think about the roadblocks researchers like Dr. Speicher are facing.
Trying to get funding.
Trying to get funding, trying to do more research, it's like they're hitting a brick wall. Makes you feel like we're kind of stumbling around in the dark here.
Big time. So what do? Dr. Speicher and these other researchers, they're calling for more research.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, is there anything we can do besides just, like, sit around and wait for answers?
Absolutely. We can get informed. Knowledge is power, right? The more we know, the better we can advocate for our own health. We can read up on this stuff, talk to others, and encourage some open, honest conversations about vaccine safety.
This isn't about fear-mongering, right? It's about having all the cards on the table so we can make the best choices for ourselves and our families.
100%. Informed decisions. That's what it's all about.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to chew on. But you know what's really got me thinking now? This whole DNA contamination thing, even if it seems like a small concern now, could it have consequences down the line that we can't even see yet?
You mean like for future generations?
Exactly. That's a big question mark for me.
And it's a question worth pondering. It highlights just how crucial continued research, transparency, and open dialogue really are. The more we understand about the long game, the better prepared we'll be if and when those consequences arise.
Couldn't agree more. Well, everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and maybe even sparked some questions of your own. Remember, staying curious and engaged in these conversations is so important when navigating the world of science and health. Until next time, keep those questions coming and stay informed.